Tonight, we have a chilling story about a woman who finally purchased land to practice her primitive skills on, only to discover a dark secret. This story is written exclusively for this channel, so if you would like to support these creative efforts, please hit that like button and subscribe as it very much brightens Lady Night Terror's day. Let's get into it. Anne's figure was barely visible in the fading autumn light. Her tall, slender frame was draped in a heavy cloak made from the skin of a deer that she had killed and whose hide she had tanned herself. Even in the dimness of the twilight, the hood of the cloak seemed to cling closely to her face, almost as if it was trying to hide her from what was going to happen later that evening. Her gaze was distant and relaxed, her stride determined, and with every step she took, the crunching of falling leaves against the soft earth could be heard in the stillness of the night. Surrounding her was the wilderness of Minnesota. Vast swaths of oak trees intermingled with maples, their leaves rustling in the breeze. Wildlife could be heard, a lone hoot of an owl, the scampering of a rabbit, and the faraway chirp of a cardinal. The smell of damp soil and pine sap filled the air. Nature was peaceful, completely unaware of the horror about to unfold in the middle of nowhere. A few miles away from that sleepy rural property, two men stood in the center of the small but unkempt house they had bought after they sold their 5 acres of undeveloped land in rural Minnesota. One of the men was shorter than the other and was named John. John was a nervous man with unsure tendencies and a whiny voice. He was constantly looking around and worrying. Right now, the focus of his concern was what they had left on their recently sold land. The other man, Ronald, was taller and more confident, but he had a menacing aura. "We should have moved the bodies when we had a chance," the shorter man said, nervously wringing his hands. The taller man snorted in response. 5 acres. You think the woman we saw poking around here is going to find it? "Maybe. We didn't bury her very deeply," he responded, his eyes darting around the room. "That woman's been digging around a lot more than I thought she would. We can't take any chances. If someone finds that body, they'll tie it to us. We gotta get rid of it now." The taller man rolled his eyes and sighed. "Fine. Let's just get it done and over with so you shut up about it." Despite his bravado, the two men shared a look, and both knew they were thinking the same thing. They should have found another way to dispose of that woman's body. Back on the land, oblivious to what was to come, the woman Anne continued her primitive skills training. At that moment, she was building a hut, using wood and pine branches in a space between some trees. She took out a primitive shovel she had made earlier, out of stone and some wood, and began to dig holes to place her wooden planks in. As she dug deeper, she suddenly spotted something unusual. It was stringy and yellow, and at first she thought it was some wheat that had somehow got buried. But as she pulled it out and touched it, rubbing the strands between her fingers, she realized it wasn't wheat. She pushed the dirt surrounding this mysterious item away, and her shovel hit something familiar. She flung the shovel to the ground and vigorously brushed her fingers against her pants, like she could erase the fact that she had casually picked up the hair of a dead person. The stringy substance was blonde hair, attached to a still rotting human head. She spent enough time in nature to know the person, presumably a woman, hadn't died that long ago, because the body was only slightly decayed. There was no cross or star or even a stack of stones nearby to mark a grave, so it appeared to be the remains of someone who was murdered and hastily buried. She glanced in the direction of her car and patted the pocket that held what she called her "oh crap" device. The device wasn't a cell phone, but she could press one button to let her family know she was all right, and a different button to call in search and rescue. Typically, she only used this device when on an unfamiliar trail, but she'd promised her family she would press the button every night to let them know she was safe, since her cell phone reception up here was spotty. And that night, she had planned to stay in her new hut. She pushed aside any thought of pressing the button for search and rescue since this wasn't an emergency. There was no helping save that dead woman. So Anne decided to head back to her car and drive towards the nearest police station. She left her shovel where it lay and crunched over the dry autumn leaves towards her vehicle. But even though the only steps she heard were her own, her senses told her she wasn't alone. Unconsciously, she picked up her pace, almost running towards her car, feeling as if someone was watching her every move. Suddenly, she heard voices coming from maybe 5 feet away. She looked around frantically searching for the source, but it was too late. The previous owners of the land had come back for the body, and now they'd found her. She shuddered, realizing how clever they'd been. She couldn't hear them because they had walked across a series of stones set up like a bridge across the creek, and as the previous owners of the property, they would know all the ways to move quietly on their land. Upon seeing the expression on Anne's face, the short, nervous guy, John, shouted, "She knows!" and ambled after her. Ronald cussed and followed after him, soon gaining and then passing John. Anne turned and dashed back towards her hut, thinking that at least she might grab her shovel. She reached in her pocket to pull out her "oh crap" device and call in search and rescue. She fumbled with the device in the dark, pushing frantically anything that was like a button, but then she stumbled on a root and dropped it. She could hear the men closing the gap between them and her, while the men grew more and more agitated as they chased her through the woods. She managed to stay one step ahead of them for a while, her bare feet quickly maneuvering across the uneven terrain. The moonlight illuminated their wild faces. As she ran, Anne heard the distinct sound of someone unholstering a gun and pulling back the slide. She panicked and tripped, her foot catching on a root. She quickly got back up, but felt a searing pain in her ankle. Her heart raced with fear as she realized she wouldn't be able to outrun them anymore. One of the men stepped forward and spoke in an angry voice that convinced her he would show no empathy. "You had to go poking around. You couldn't just enjoy this land." Then John stepped forward, panting, but looking relaxed for the first time in his life. Sweat dripped down Anne's neck, and she could feel the intensity of their stares. She pressed her fingers into the earth, grabbed a clump of moist dirt, and threw it at Ronald's face. He blinked, flinched, and pulled the trigger. Anne let out a piercing scream as the bullet hit her knee, and even though he would never admit it, the scream scared Ronald so much that he pulled the trigger again and shot her in the head. Anne slumped back onto the earth she loved so dearly, never to rise again. Ronald turned to John. "Go find the other body. We're going to burn them this time. Throw the leftover bones in the ocean. It's about time I get out of this state." And that's what they started to do, until about a half hour later, when the search and rescue Anne had summoned showed up. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy woodsy stories, why not check out the one on the screen now? It's called Harvest Festival Hunger and is my favorite story I've written so far. See you in the next one.